progressive. We've only got 2 more days, but do not feel the need to stand or sit, depending on what makes you most comfortable during the course of the next 2 days, notwithstanding that she might say all rise. If it's more comfortable for you to stay seated, you stay seated, all right? I shan't take it as an offence.
Okay, grateful again, Mr. Chairman, very grateful.
If you just give me 1 moment, I want to get my notebook, which I left on my desk, so just 1 moment, please. Right, well, the notebook hasn't arrived yet. I'm sure it will do. I've got a page at the moment to be making some notes. So you make your start, and no doubt it'll arrive in due course. Thank you very much.
I'm again grateful, Mr. Chairman. These closing statements are presented on behalf of the Seamen and Waterfront Trade Union, the SWWTU, which was granted standing in these proceedings on the 14th of September 2022. The SWWTU's request to participate in the hearings before the Commission was firmly supported by the Industrial Transport Workers Federation, which is called the ITF, an international seafarers union with its headquarters in London, England. The ITF is the largest global independent international union of transport workers in all sectors in the world and operates through nearly 700 affiliate trade unions, operates in 150 countries, and of course the local affiliate is the SWWTU. The ITF connects over 20 million workers and is allied to an even larger union called the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, which represents over 200 million workers. The primary missions of both the ITF and the ITUC are the promotion and defense of workers' rights and interests, including advocating for safe working environments and systems. Our client, the SWWTU, membership includes seafarers' interests, offshore workers, and other marine professionals who undertake commercial operations in many capacities and circumstances in both the private and public sectors in Trinidad and Tobago. The union has collaborated with the ILO, or the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, and the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization. These global organizations named have expressed their collective concerns with respect to the tragic circumstances in which Mr. Kazim Ali Jr., Mr. Yusuf Henry, Mr. Faisal Kurban, and Mr. Rishi Nagasar met their tragic and untimely deaths. I have taken the time to state firmly the interest which myself and Mr. Hussein Shah represent so that our involvement in the Commission's hearings can be fully contextualized. We had no interest to serve, no client to defend or represent beyond the advancement of safety for workers. Rather, we sought to assist in having fully ventilated the pre-work processes engaged and the actual execution of the work for which LMCS had been engaged to undertake. We attempted also to highlight the work experience and or competencies of the various witnesses who came before the Commission, again with a view to placing into focus the personnel which each of the main parties to the inquiry placed the planning and execution of the pre-works, the contracted repairs to the riser at berth 6 of Sea Line 36, and the rescue of the stricken divers who ultimately became entrapped in Sea Line 36 and met their deaths in circumstances which the nation and beyond have come to know all too well. To the families who lost their sons, fathers, and brothers, and to the deceased men's friends and loved ones, we extend our deepest condolences. It is our clients and their legal team's most fervent wish that the proceedings before the Commission and its eventual findings will bring some closure and sense of justice. Other legal teams will, no doubt, engage in other processes in due course, which will have the effect of further ventilating and resolving the facts and evidence which were elicited during the Honourable Commission's proceedings. The Honourable Commission has been tasked inter alia with making such recommendations which address the shortcomings, which will have the effect of addressing the shortcomings of the work processes of the two main parties before the Commission. No doubt the roles of other parties, such as the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, TTCG, may be examined. Similarly, our client has committed to use its role in such organizations as the ILO and the IMO to bring about improvements in the work standards touching and concerning, in particular, the diving industry in Trinidad and Tobago. No doubt the findings and the ultimate report of the Honourable Commission will be the foundation of these objectives. As we learned from the witness statement submitted by the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, only a voluntary standard for commercial diving exists in Trinidad and Tobago, which can be used by choice by the stakeholders in the industry, and I quote, at their own discretion to guide their operating practices. Despite the fact that Trinidad and Tobago boasts a mature oil and gas sector, as well as a shipping industry, the powers that be have taken no step to regulate the diving industry, which plays an integral and supportive role in these industries which employ thousands of men and women. By any objective standard, this is simply an unacceptable state of affairs. Our client's respectful recommendation is that a regulatory framework be put in place for commercial diving operations in Trinidad and Tobago. This would include prescribing minimum certification for persons undertaking commercial diving works, audit and certification of schools providing instructions to such persons, inspection and audit of diving equipment. We would expect that the said regulatory framework would include robust powers of oversight, enforcement and prosecution of employers who depart from what would now be a mandatory regulatory framework. The interests we represent are of the considered view that if such standards, even on all fours with the 2010 voluntary standards annexed to the witness statement of Ms. Ramachala of the TTBS, had been implemented, then the tragedy which occurred on the 25th of February 2022 may very well not have occurred. And in the event that a Delta P incident occurred, the divers could and would have been retrieved through topside tendering. I will not seek in a detailed way to critique the actions or inactions, Mr. Ramada has done that so much better than me, of the main protagonists in respect of the circumstances which led to this unfortunate tragedy. This task will also fall to the learned counsel to the Commission. I will, however, in a very brief way, touch on certain evidence which has emerged in respect of the work processes engaged by both Paria and LMCS. LMCS. It is clear from the testimony led before the Commission that LMCS is a contractor with a considerable track record in Petrotrans and now Paria Trading Company's operations. Indeed, in the year 2020, LMCS had undertaken closely similar works to the riser situate at berth 5. LMCS chose, as we heard, to execute the diving component of the repair works to the riser at berth 6 using scuba equipment. This methodology was clearly outlined by LMCS in its tender and had been previously accepted by Paria during the then and current works, as well as previous works. LMCS broke no regulatory provisions by using scuba equipment to gain access to the habitat, which had been placed over the work site, which was at berth 6 riser at 2C line 36. Because there was then and still no regulatory provisions which required the use of commercial diving equipment, which would have involved surface supplied air, and that the divers be harnessed and tended from the surface. LMCS's diving supervisor admitted that had the divers at minimum been harnessed by rope, which could have been attached to their respective hips, then when the Delta P event occurred, they could have been retrieved immediately, and we would not be here today, and the family members from whom we have heard would not have experienced the heart-wrenching hurt that must have been attended not only with the accident, but with the management of same after the fact. I share the Commission's sentiments that much more was required to keep the families physically accommodated and informed of the status of their loved ones, and the efforts, if any, to rescue them. We have heard and read much about the emergency response plans of both Paria and LMCS, but it is now unarguable that both these plans and the purported implementation of same fell woefully short. By way of example only, at core bundle page 883, the list of standby divers who presumably would be available in the event of an emergency included LMCS's dive supervisor, Andrew Farrar, who was not geared up to enter the water as required by industry norms, as well as Rishi Nagasar and Faisal Kurban, who were actually in the habitat and presumably involved in the execution of the works. In addition, LMCS did not appear to have put in place hyperbaric chambers in the event that the divers were retrieved after prolonged entrapment in the pipe. Christopher Budram was literally left to fight for a chamber, which he ultimately was not afforded due to a false COVID-19 finding. There's no evidence that specialized medical practitioners or EMTs were put on standby or were, in fact, in place, either before the accident or after. It appears that there were other divers, such as Conan Bedo, whom we heard from, were on a very loose standby arrangement and could be called out in the event of emergency. But such divers were not on site or even in close proximity to Paria's operations. It is noteworthy that LMCS's tender documents cited a number of commercial divers who would be utilized in the contracted works, but who did not appear to play any part in those works. Whatever information was received from the GoPro footage does not appear to have been shared with Paria's personnel. And in general, it appears that both Paria and LMCS were operating in silos and not in tandem to achieve the only objective, which was to rescue the stricken divers. There was no evidence that LMCS contemplated the risk attendant to a Delta P event occurring, nor put in place any contingencies to mitigate or manage that risk, or indeed to respond to the outcome of same. To the contrary, by removing an unquantified amount of line contents in C line 36 and introducing air into the line, LMCS created the environment for differential pressures to exist, which ultimately led to the Delta P event, which caused the 5 divers to be sucked into the pipeline. Even though LMCS was a well-experienced contractor, they failed to recognize the inherent risk to their divers in removing the habitat and the decommissioning of the air compressor, which was pumping oxygen into seam, and for that matter, removing the flange at berth 5. Paria. Senior and more junior officers of Paria gave evidence before the commission. On the round, these employees of Paria and or Kenson were content to advance that the contract put out to tender and eventually awarded to LMCS was a turnkey one and a specialist job for which a competent specialist contractor had been sought. This position was oft-repeated, starting with Mr. Hassan Mohammed. It is pellucid that Paria relies on outsourced employees and outsourced contractors to undertake not only its day-to-day operations, but also its technical work, such as repairs to pipelines. From various testimonies given and tested, it emerged that Paria does not have the technical expertise in-house or through Kenson to evaluate technical tenders, and more so to supervise or to monitor the resulting execution of technical work. Paria could only review or evaluate risk factors, this is their evidence, which have been drawn to their attention, which would have been drawn to their attention by LMCS. Paria was not aware of the exact amount of the contents of sea line 36 and took no measurement of what was removed either into their slop barges or their tanks onshore. There was a lack of clarity on the documentation as to whether sea line 36 was required to be fully drained, or only partially so, as to create sufficient ullage to install the migration barriers. The most telling evidence that Paria did not have the technical know-how to manage the situation, which evolved on February 25, 2022, is its decision to operate in silos from the specialist contractor, and indeed also from available personnel with diving experience at Heritage Petroleum, its own sister company. Paria or its affiliate company, Heritage, called out several diving experts, OTSL, Mitchell's Professional Diving, Hull Support System, Hull Support Services, and the TTCG. But aside from instructing TTCG to stop divers from entering the pipeline to attempt to effect a rescue of the 4 men, the aid and assistance of these specialist diving company was not put in train. We know now that the TTCG divers were not trained, nor did they have the equipment to enter the pipeline. We know that Mitchell's divers indicated they were too big to enter the pipeline. And we know now that OTSL and Subsea Global Solutions vessels, equipment, divers, and the supervisors on these vessels were told to stand by for instructions which ultimately did not come. And therefore, they departed their Paria berths early on Saturday, 26 February 2022. We know now that the reason that a rescue of the men was not attempted was due to Paria's lack of knowledge of the conditions in the pipeline and what obstructions were in seam. Ultimately, it appears that the only identifiable obstruction was a partially buoyant and therefore partially or fully empty dive tank which Christopher Boudram was able to swim past, and a crawler impaired by a slippery environment within the pipe was able to push some 19 feet. Paria pursued ascertaining the line condition as a precondition to an attempted rescue, but seemingly bypassed the narrative of Christopher Boudram, who had actually emerged from the same pipe and therefore would have been the best source of information which they so ardently pursued. More than one Paria representative had close contact and or was in close proximity to Christopher Boudram, but no effort was made to speak to him to ascertain the location of the divers, and their physical condition, and the conditions in the line. And one will presume that these were critical bits of information which could be utilized to effect a rescue or to plan a rescue. In fact, it is only at almost 10 p.m. that Friday night that a brief telephone communication is established between Christopher Boudram and the ICT team. Accepting what Christopher Boudram relayed that night, the 4 remaining divers I'll give the competition a little time. The 4 remaining divers could have been 2 seam lengths away from the end of the horizontal of the pipe, even using Mr. Piper's estimation, which was 120 feet away from the elbow, or in my calculation, which is likely to be flawed, 1/10 of the length of the horizontal pipe. Even when it became clear that a borescope, an ROV, and a crawler could not successfully maneuver the pipeline, Paria did not allow willing, able, and available divers to attempt a rescue, even though that by at least somewhere between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., there was optimal equipment and sufficiently trained and experienced commercial divers on site. Paria has been pertinacious in its stance that they had to protect the would-be rescuers who were trained and experienced divers who could, with experienced and qualified dive supervisors, devise a safe entry and exit methodology. Instead, Paria called the emergency response services, who are confined space technicians trained in rescues in dry environments, and who had no diving expertise. Mr. Johnson's evidence was, however, important in that he was able to explain that his company was not called until almost midnight of Friday, the 25th. And he was not told that the intended rescue would be a subsea one into a water-filled pipe. Mr. Johnson's evidence was also important in that it explained that a quick dynamic assessment could be undertaken and a rescue plan devised therefrom. Such a plan would not involve a detailed written job safety analysis, a method statement, and other such documentation which apparently Paria required in order to permit the rescue of the men. Mr. Antonio Donowa, and Mr. Krishna Fuentes were addendum that a rescue should be done as quickly as possible. And it is also noteworthy that by the time that Mr. Johnson arrives, he is already told that he and his team should expect a recovery effort and not a rescue effort. We have heard from various Paria senior officials, one of whom was brought to tears, and one of whom the Commission allowed to vent his very pent-up angst. I and those whom I represent do not believe that Paria was placed in an easy position on the night of Friday, the 25th of February. But Paria must accept that they made very wrong decisions on that night and the day following, which ultimately cost these men their lives. While Paria's officials were happy to distance themselves from LMCS's work plan because it was a turnkey contract where the company could rely on a specialist contractor, Paria ultimately did not allow the same specialist contractor to undertake or to coordinate a well-planned and well-equipped rescue attempt. Paria was not even prepared to rely on the diving expertise residing with its sister company, Heritage. We heard from Mr. Piper that an air hose in his witness statement that an air hose should be sent down to the men in order to provide air to them. We hear nothing further of that, other than that one line in his witness statement. And ultimately, no such air hose was sent to the men, whether through PVC or any other mechanism, as Mr. Ramadan has said. In this inquiry, there were many villains. And I know counsel here today will vilify and exculpate the protagonists in equal turn. However, it would be remiss of me not to point out the heroes. These were the volunteer rescue divers who were willing to risk life and limb to save their brother divers, and asked for no reward to do so. These are the heroes. On a final note, I wish to thank the many persons, some of them retirees of Petrotrin and Trinmar, who reached out to both Mr. Hussein Shah and myself to provide valuable information. I particularly want to thank the honorable commissioners, the chairman and Mr. Commissioner Wilson, for their indulgences, their graciousness, and their patience, both with Mr. Hussein Shah and myself. I reiterate once again that the findings of the Commission will find its way in the international fora that I have described, with the hopes that we can apply some degree of pressure for the diving standards, at least, to be more robustly, put into a regulatory framework and robustly policed. And I have one correction to make, so I don't want to fall into an unfortunate error that is another witness, that it was my error when I indicated that Dr. Chetty had been introduced to me by the OWTU or some of their membership. That was entirely correct. It's a separate person. I've spoken to a lot of people in the last couple of months, so that was my error, and I apologize if anybody was offended by that or took issue with that. And I would also say, judging from the front of one of the daily newspapers, I've only caught the front page, he was also not recommended by my own client, which is the SWWTU. And as I said, the chairman is quite correct. I have been in practice long enough to see many a witness fall apart, not perhaps in such a spectacular fashion, but certainly in other ways. And I do thank my honorable friends, I can't say at the bar table, at the various tables to the side of me and to the back of me, and the honorable chair, the honorable commission's attorneys, for also their indulgences and kindnesses, and also for Ms. Sinanan, who I have harassed by email and otherwise for some time. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. Right. So what we'll do now, it's just 5 minutes past 1. As I said, I have a short administrative matter to deal with this afternoon at 5 minutes past 2. So we'll resume at 2:15, please. 2:15 for Mr. Pigus to address us. And you indicated you thought you'd be less than an hour in any event.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Yes. Good. Well, that's where we'll break off then, and I'll see everybody at 2:15. Thank you.
All rise.